His thighs were tense, muscles tight beneath his jeans, his hands resting there, fingers slightly curled like he was holding back from moving, from doing something about the tension building inside him. Under the stiff fabric, something undeniable pressed against the confined space, a quiet but impossible to ignore presence. I'd never really thought much about elevators before. To me, they were just practical machines, metal boxes meant to move people between floors without any real meaning. They were background noise in the rhythm of everyday life. But right then, under the flickering glow of the emergency lights, crammed into the tight, stalled elevator with my stepson so close I could feel the heat coming off him, I realized something: elevators weren't just for moving people. They could also be traps, locking people together in spaces too small, too intimate, forcing them into situations that couldn't be taken back. The day had started like any other. It was a slow Friday afternoon at the office, the kind where everyone's just counting down the minutes until the weekend. Most of my coworkers had already left, eager to get a head start on their plans. I stayed behind, like I usually did, burying myself in reports and paperwork. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Anything was better than going home to the empty house waiting for me. My husband, Richard, was off on another one of his business trips, and the silence of our home had become something I avoided rather than welcomed. I was still at my desk, flipping through the last few pages of a contract, when my phone buzzed against the wood. The sound was sharp in the quiet office. Ryan. Surprise. I'm downstairs. I stared at the message, my pulse jumping in a way I couldn't explain. Ryan, my husband's son from his first marriage, had been away at college for months. We hadn't talked much, not beyond the polite, surface-level stuff. He was independent, distant, always wrapped up in his own world. So why was he here now, unannounced? A strange unease settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside, grabbing my things and heading for the elevator. Within minutes, I was stepping inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The doors slid open, and there he was. Ryan had always been good-looking in a way that was hard to ignore, but now, standing in front of me, he seemed different. His features had sharpened, his jawline more defined, his posture radiating a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. His dark eyes locked onto mine, steady and unflinching, and for a second, just a breathless second, I forgot how to breathe. "You weren't answering my calls," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge I couldn't quite place. He stepped inside, and instinctively, I followed. The doors slid shut behind us. I opened my mouth to ask why he was here, but before I could get a word out, the elevator jolted violently, the floor lurching under our feet. Then everything went still, except for us. Then darkness. A mechanical groan echoed through the shaft as the elevator came to a sudden stop. The emergency light flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the cramped space. I reached for the control panel, pressing buttons frantically. Nothing. "We're stuck," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ryan let out a sharp exhale, running a hand through his hair. "Looks like it." Silence settled between us, heavy and suffocating. The air felt warmer, the space impossibly smaller. My heart pounded, not from fear but from something far more dangerous. I tried pressing the buttons again, but nothing happened. The elevator stayed still, trapping us in its dim, humming silence. Ryan leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. "Guess we wait," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. I wasn't amused. My heartbeat was erratic, and the space suddenly felt even smaller than it had a moment ago. The air was thick, warm, tinged with the faint scent of his cologne, woody, unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. "You okay?" he asked, his gaze steady on me. I nodded automatically, even though my pulse was racing. The truth was, I wasn't okay. Something about being here alone with him unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. The emergency light flickered again, casting moving shadows across his face. He had changed since the last time I'd seen him, his features sharper, his presence heavier. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made my stomach tighten. I turned away, willing the walls to feel wider, the air to feel cooler, but there was no escaping the closeness, no escaping the way his eyes lingered on me. Then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. We haven't really talked in a while. I inhaled, steadying myself. You've been busy with school. His lips quirked into something like a smirk, but not quite. And you've been busy avoiding me. The words hit harder than they should have. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the way he looked at me, like he already knew the truth, made it impossible to speak. The elevator remained still, the silence stretching, and somewhere in the quiet, a line we'd never acknowledged began to blur. I exhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral. I haven't been avoiding you. Ryan tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes unreadable. No? Then why do you always leave the room when I walk in? A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to say it wasn't true, but we both knew it was. I'd noticed it happening more and more, those subtle, unspoken moments where I'd excuse myself when he entered, where I kept our conversations brief, where I avoided looking at him for too long. I turned away, pressing the emergency call button again, hoping for a response. Nothing but static. The elevator remained still, locking us in place. My hands felt clammy, my pulse uneven. The air was too thick, too charged with something I didn't want to name. Ryan sighed, shifting slightly. I used to think you didn't like me. My head snapped toward him. That's not true. He let out a low chuckle. Maybe not. But you act like being around me makes you uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The word was too simple for what I felt. I forced a small, tight smile. You're imagining things. Ryan didn't reply right away. He just studied me, his gaze lingering. The space between us wasn't much, 3 feet at most, but it felt like nothing. I see the way you look at me, he murmured. My breath caught. A flicker of something dangerous passed between us, something neither of us should have acknowledged. I shook my head. Ryan, this is. The lights flickered again, the elevator shuddered, but still, it didn't move. The small jolt made me stumble, and in an instant, his hands were on me, steadying me. His grip was firm, warm, stronger than I expected. I should have pulled away immediately, but I didn't. His hands lingered, fingers pressing lightly against my arms, sending heat through my skin. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Too close. Too warm. Finally, I stepped back, my breath unsteady. We should focus on getting out of here. Ryan's gaze stayed on me for a moment longer before he nodded, sliding his hands into his pockets. Yeah, he said. Probably. But something had shifted. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore, it was thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the way his touch still lingered on my skin. I pressed my palms against the cool metal of the elevator wall, trying to steady my breathing. The space felt smaller now, as if the walls were inching closer, leaving no room for escape. The air was thick with something I refused to name, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for longer than I cared to admit. Ryan leaned against the opposite wall, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. There was no smugness, no teasing smirk, just quiet, patient curiosity, as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge what we both knew was there. I focused on the emergency panel again, pressing the call button one more time, but the only response was the same static-filled silence. Frustration bubbled inside me, mixing with the unease that had settled deep in my stomach. This is ridiculous, I muttered under my breath, rubbing my temples. Ryan's voice was calm when he spoke. You're not claustrophobic, are you? No, I answered too quickly. His lips twitched, as if he'd caught my lie. I wasn't afraid of small spaces, I was afraid of this space, the way it forced me to acknowledge things I'd spent months trying to ignore. He shifted, pushing off the wall and moving a step closer. We might be in here a while. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as he closed the distance between us. He wasn't doing anything inappropriate, wasn't touching me, wasn't even crowding me, but his presence was overpowering, stealing the air between us. I'd always known Ryan was attractive, but in the past, it had been an abstract thought, something I dismissed as an objective fact rather than a personal observation. But standing here now, in the dim glow of the emergency light, I saw him differently. The sharp cut of his jaw, the confident way he carried himself, the intensity in his eyes that held me in place. He wasn't a boy anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. I forced myself to breathe, to pull my thoughts back from dangerous territory. "We just need to stay calm and wait for help," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Ryan studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He sat down on the floor, stretching out his legs like he had all the time in the world. I hesitated, then did the same, keeping a safe distance between us. Minutes passed in silence, but it wasn't a comfortable one. Every breath felt too loud, every small movement too noticeable. I was hyper-aware of him, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers tapped absently against his knee, the occasional glance he stole in my direction. Then he spoke, his voice quieter now. "Do you ever get lonely?" The question caught me off guard. I turned to look at him, expecting some kind of joke in his expression, but there was none. He was serious. I hesitated, then let out a small, humorless laugh. "That's a strange thing to ask." He shrugged. "Not really. I just wonder sometimes. You always seem distant." I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come. Because he wasn't wrong. Loneliness had become such a constant in my life that I barely noticed it anymore. It was there in the quiet of the house when Richard was away, in the long hours at work that I used as a distraction, in the empty spaces of my marriage where love had once lived. Instead of answering, I looked away, focusing on the dim glow of the elevator light. But Ryan didn't press. He just watched me, as if he already understood the truth I wasn't ready to admit. Somewhere far above us, the building creaked, metal groaning as the weight of the elevator pressed against its cables. The sound sent a small shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay still. Ryan's voice was softer now, more careful. "I used to think you were cold." I turned to him, startled by the honesty in his tone. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "When I was younger, I thought you didn't care about me. You were always so put together, so controlled. I didn't think you ever felt anything." A lump formed in my throat, unexpected and heavy. "That's not true." He nodded slowly. "I know that now." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us had changed again, shifting from uncomfortable to something deeper, something heavier. It wasn't just words being exchanged, it was understanding, a recognition of something we'd both ignored for too long. And in that moment, as his eyes held mine in the dim light, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sure I wanted to ignore it anymore. The elevator was silent except for the faint hum of electricity and the occasional groan of metal shifting overhead. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the steady rise and fall of my chest, but it was impossible. Because I wasn't alone. Because Ryan was sitting too close, watching me with an expression that was too knowing, too aware. Because no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel the weight of his presence pressing into the air between us, thick and inescapable. I shifted slightly, folding my arms over my chest as if that could shield me from whatever was happening in this confined space. But when I moved, my gaze flickered downward, just for a second, just long enough to see the unmistakable tension in his body, the way his muscles had gone rigid beneath his clothes. Heat flushed up my neck as I realized what it was. A deep, unsettling awareness settled into my bones, making it impossible to look away. His thighs were tense, his hands resting there, fingers curled slightly as if fighting to remain still. And there, beneath the fabric of his jeans, something undeniable strained against the tight space. My breath caught. I looked away sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs. No. This wasn't happening. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the moment to pass, willing my body to stop reacting to something I had no business noticing. But the damage was already done. The image had seared itself into my mind, impossible to erase. Ryan shifted slightly, clearing his throat. His voice was lower when he spoke. "You're thinking too much." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on the elevator doors. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice barely steady. He let out a quiet, almost amused breath. "Yes, you do." The air between us was suffocating. I needed space. I needed this elevator to move, to break whatever spell had settled over us before it was too late. But it didn't move. The world outside didn't exist. There was only this. Only him. Only the quiet tension wrapping around us like a slow-burning fuse. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I kept my eyes on the elevator doors, willing them to open, but they remained closed, trapping us in this moment, trapping me with thoughts I shouldn't be having. Ryan shifted beside me, exhaling a slow breath. The air felt warmer now, the space impossibly small. His presence was overpowering, pressing into me in ways I wasn't sure I could ignore much longer. Then, without warning, he reached for the hem of his hoodie, pulling it over his head in one smooth motion before tossing it aside. The movement was casual, but it sent a ripple of awareness through me. "It's too damn hot in here," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze to remain neutral. He wasn't wrong. The air inside the stalled elevator was growing thick and stifling, our combined body heat only making it worse. Still, the sudden removal of clothing made something tighten in my chest. Then, to my horror, he moved again. He unbuttoned his jeans. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat as he lifted his hips slightly, sliding the denim down his legs before kicking them off completely. Now he was sitting there in nothing but a simple t-shirt and a pair of dark boxer briefs, completely at ease, as if the situation was the most natural thing in the world. His posture was relaxed, his legs stretched out before him, his back resting lazily against the cold metal wall of the elevator. He exuded a quiet confidence, utterly unbothered by our predicament. A sharp, unbidden heat surged through me, spreading like wildfire beneath my skin, an instinctive reaction I couldn't suppress, no matter how much I tried. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself to look anywhere but at him, as if avoiding his gaze would somehow keep my body from betraying me. My pulse was a relentless drumbeat in my ears, each beat louder than the last. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice steady but barely above a whisper. Ryan tilted his head slightly, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He leaned back even further, his arms draping loosely at his sides, as though he had not a single care in the world. "Relax," he murmured, his tone laced with amusement. "It's just hot as hell in here. Not like I'm naked." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingertips to my temples, willing my thoughts to realign, to regain some semblance of composure. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. And yet, my body knew otherwise. Every muscle in me was taut, locked in place, a stark contrast to the casual ease with which he sat beside me. The warmth of him was impossible to ignore, the quiet intensity of his presence pressing into my senses like an unseen force. He hadn't moved, and yet the space between us felt dangerously small. Too small. Too suffocating. His voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "You feel it too, don't you?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Ryan, this isn't." He shifted then, just slightly, just enough to close a fraction of the already minimal distance between us. "Isn't what?" His voice was lower now, quieter, but beneath it lay something else, something raw, something unspoken yet undeniable. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the weight of his words, refusing to acknowledge what was happening between us. But then he moved again, just enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from his skin, dangerously close to mine. "Tell me you don't feel it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I parted my lips, ready to deny it, ready to rebuild the distance between us with a simple lie. But before I could speak, his fingers brushed lightly over my wrist, a barely there touch, feather light, yet it sent a searing heat through me, a quiet fire that burned through my resolve. I sucked in a sharp breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the small, enclosed space. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing against my lungs, and I regretted the inhale instantly. Because when I finally turned to face him, when our eyes met in the dim glow of the elevator lights, I knew, deep in my bones, in the quickened rhythm of my pulse, that I was already lost. The space was too dark, the silence too suffocating, wrapping around us like an unspoken truth neither of us had the courage to say aloud. The weight of every moment we had ignored, every glance we had held too long, every unsaid word that had hovered between us like an impending storm, crashed down all at once. It was inevitable. It had always been inevitable. And then, without warning, it happened. I wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Or maybe it had been building for so long that the decision had already been made for us long before this moment. 1 second, there was hesitation, an agonizing pause where the air between us crackled with possibility. The next, there was none at all. His lips found mine, soft at first, uncertain, as if waiting for me to stop this before it could begin, as if he was testing the boundaries of what we both knew shouldn't happen. But I didn't stop him. I couldn't. The warmth of his mouth sent a shiver down my spine, unraveling every carefully constructed barrier I had built, scattering every rational thought that screamed at me to pull away. I was drowning in him, in the way he tasted, heat and something unknown, something forbidden, something that made my breath stutter and my body tense with a longing I didn't fully understand. For one impossible, reckless moment, I let myself fall. I let myself sink into the kiss, into the feeling of his hands ghosting over my skin, into the intoxicating pull of something I had spent too long denying. I let myself forget my name, my marriage, the life I had spent years curating with painstaking precision. None of it existed here. None of it mattered. But reality has a way of returning, sharp and unforgiving. It hit me like a jolt, like icy water against fevered skin. I pulled away, breathless, my fingers trembling as they brushed against my lips, still warm, still tingling from his touch. Ryan didn't move. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his breath unsteady, his eyes dark and unreadable as they held mine, searching, waiting. "We can't," I whispered, but even as I said the words, my voice betrayed me. Because deep down, we both knew I wasn't sure if I truly meant them. Ryan studied me intently, his gaze lingering on my face for what felt like an eternity. His expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite decipher. Then, with deliberate slowness, he leaned back against the wall, exhaling softly through his nose. The sound was almost lost in the charged silence between us. "Tell me you didn't want that," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet carrying the weight of something undeniable. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wrapped around us, thick and heavy, pressing down like an unspoken truth neither of us was willing to voice. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, the echo of his lips on mine still burning, still there, refusing to fade. My breath came in short, uneven gasps, and no matter how much I tried to steady myself, I couldn't shake the way he had unraveled me in just a few fleeting moments. Ryan remained completely still, his body relaxed against the wall, but his eyes, dark, intense, unwavering, never left mine. He was watching me, studying me, waiting for something. But he didn't push. He didn't repeat the question. He didn't demand an answer. And yet, the space between us was thick with everything we had left unsaid, things we had both spent too long ignoring, too afraid to acknowledge. Now, there was no more pretending. No more looking away. I knew what I should have done. I should have forced myself to move, should have pressed the emergency button again, should have banged on the elevator doors, anything to shatter the unbearable tension crackling between us. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at him. Really looked at him. And in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. The dim glow of the emergency light barely illuminated the small space, casting elongated shadows that flickered against the walls. Yet, even in the half-darkness, I could make out the sharp angles of his jawline, the way the subtle light caught on his cheekbones, the almost imperceptible movement of his chest as he breathed, slow, steady, controlled. His hands, however, told a different story. Resting on his thighs, his fingers flexed and curled, tension rippling through them, as if he were struggling to keep himself in check, holding back something unspoken. But his eyes, those dark, searching eyes, carried a weight that words could never fully express. There was a question in them, silent but heavy, lingering between us like an unbroken thread stretched to its limit. He was waiting. Waiting for me to decide. For so long, my mind had been a battlefield of hesitation, overthinking, and doubt. But in this moment, with the air between us thick with something I could no longer ignore, I let go. I let myself stop thinking. Slowly, deliberately, I straightened my posture, my hands settling in my lap, palms pressing lightly against the soft fabric of my dress. The material clung to my skin, damp from the warmth of the enclosed space, suddenly feeling too tight, too suffocating, like a barrier I hadn't realized I was still wearing. A barrier between me and the truth I had been running from for far too long. Ryan's gaze flickered downward, his throat working as he swallowed, his restraint fraying at the edges. The air felt charged, alive, humming with unspoken intent. My breath came slow, measured, as I reached for the thin strap on my shoulder. My fingers trembled, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with the weight of the moment, the inevitability of what was to come. I pulled the strap down, the motion deliberate, almost defiant. The silence between us shattered with a single, sharp inhale, his. I should have felt ashamed. The rational part of me told me I should have hesitated, should have second-guessed myself, should have been afraid of what came next. But I didn't. Because as Ryan shifted closer, as his fingers lifted, hesitating for only a fraction of a second, before tracing the fabric as it slipped from my skin, I realized something with absolute certainty: there was no turning back. The line had already been crossed, blurred beyond recognition. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I didn't care. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. Your support, even if it feels like a small gesture, means the world to us and keeps us creating stories that matter. Don't forget to give this a like if it resonated with you. Every interaction helps us grow and connect with you through the stories we share. Thank you for being part of this community.